The Obon Festival, a tradition brought over by the Japanese, is a time when people dance and light lanterns to free the souls of dead ancestors. This Asian notion of the soul and afterlife is the foundation for many ghost stories.
The Japanese, Chinese, and Korean notion of the soul and the afterlife is very similar. The Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans, as did the native Hawaiians, believed that when a person died, his or her soul descended into an underworld. And while in the underworld, the living were required to pray for that soul so that it quickly pass out of the underworld punishments or purifications into a heavenly place where it would no longer harm the living. Chinese, Japanese, and Korean ritual is geared towards freeing the soul from the underworld hell and sending it off to heaven. And from this originates many of the so-called ghost stories.
When Li Chu died in 1924, his family packed his bones in a suitcase and planned to take him back to China. But World War II prevented that. So for many years, his bones remained in a suitcase at the Mānoa Chinese Cemetery, until he sent a message to his grandson's wife.
A friend came back, and she and I were talking, and she channels spirits, and she said that there was a message for me to give to my husband. His grandfather wanted to ask for help, and she could see him. She said he was so sad, and he was holding himself, and he wanted help. So I called Michael Saso, and he was my teacher, my religion teacher at the university. And Michael said we should go to the temple and see the monk, whose name is Shen Hu, and have him say a prayer to quiet the spirit. So I called Popo Ching, and I asked her for the name of her father, invited her to go with us. When we got to the temple, we talked to Shen Hu. He wanted to know what we wanted. And so we told him we didn't know what to do about this grandfather in the suitcase.
Using an ancient ritual, Shen Hu talked to the spirit of the grandfather who said he would bring disaster on the family.
Then he shook some yarrow sticks, and they'd come out of this little thing, and each stick would say something. So he asked the question of the spirit, do you want to go back to China? And the answer was no. And then he asked, do you want to go back into the ground? And the answer was no. And then he asked, do you want to stay in the suitcase? And the answer was no. And if I do, I'll bring disaster to all the descendants. So then the last question was, do you want to go to the temple? And the answer was yes. So we thanked the priests, and we left.
But before TEDDI Ching and her family could leave the temple, Shen Hu's prediction of disaster had already begun.
And there were just 2 little steps, and Popo Ching she just suddenly tumbled and fell really hard on the side. And when we lifted her, she was injured, really badly in her ribs and on the side of her legs. And the priest came out and looked, and Michael Saso came out, and then they both went in. And when we went back in, they said we needed to take care of the spirit immediately, that things are already beginning to happen.
To bring their grandfather to the temple, TEDDI Ching and her husband had to ask permission from the rest of the family.
And it was really amazing because someone had just had a bypass surgery and someone had just had open heart surgery. So there were already things that were happening to them. And then everyone said yes, and we went back to the priest and found an auspicious date. And that was the date to go and pick up the suitcase with grandfather and take it to the temple where they cremated the bones. And then they picked another auspicious date, and we had this ritual that was really beautiful. And everyone is happy. And I've talked to, just 2 nights ago, I've talked to the aunts and uncles, and everyone is fine and very healthy. And Popo Ching is in her 80s and is very healthy. So it's really a happy ending. It's very nice.